out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating, the Aston Villa 1987-88 module, with a little bit of overlap either side as well. You can't just go 87-88 when it comes to Villa. You've got to say, you know, where it all came from and a little bit of where it went to. Making his debut today, we have Ivan McDouall. Ivan, welcome. Welcome to the podcast. First things first, thoughts on Blue Peter?
Thoughts on Blue Peter?
Yes, your general thoughts on Blue Peter. Are you pro Blue Peter?
Okay, well, no, good question. Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me. Really looking forward to my debut. But yeah, Blue Peter, it was kind of an institution as a child, and have very vivid memories of the garden and various pets and things like that. I've got to admit, Stephen, I probably haven't thought about Blue Peter for about a decade. So that stumped me a little bit. But yeah, some childhood nostalgia, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, general thoughts. Were you kind of like a Blue Peter kid, or was it kind of like, because I think it's very much a Marmite television program as far as children are concerned, of just trying to gauge what type of camp you were in. I
don't think I what would be described as a Blue Peter kid. I mean, I remember at one point, it was probably into the 90s, they very famously did this Thunderbird Island, Tracy Island model.
Oh, yes.
Remember that? And I suppose what sums up my relationship with Blue Peter is I would sort of see that and think, gosh, that would be really good to make that, but never would make it. So that probably sums me up.
Absolutely. We're off on the right foot, though. Ivan, we are off on the right foot. We've previously, in previous modules, we like to throw this one out to debutantes. Yeah, for the vast majority of us, Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating, we weren't Blue Peter kids. We were it was very much viewed as kind of, at best, an extra school lesson in the day via your television set. At worst, propaganda for the Thatcher youth. So yeah, don't get me wrong. You know, they had a stormtrooper on one time in R2D2 that Stu Horsfield has kind of like pointed out to us. But yeah, in general,
some vague positives.
But Blue Peter wasn't where it was at for us. Aston, why give us why Aston Villa 87-88? I mean, you're a huge Aston Villa fan. You've written books on Aston Villa. What is it particularly about this vintage of Villa that piques your interest?
Well, I think 87-88 represents this kind of key moment in what was just a tumultuous kind of decade, really, for Aston Villa Football Club. And I mean, even, you know, partly going beyond a decade, you know, as we've talked about in the past, you know, Villa were a third division side, second division side, you know, until 1975. So then we get to this kind of period under Ron Saunders where Villa expand and grow, and we're going to talk through some of that. And they, you know, reach the pinnacle, you know, they reach the mountaintop, if you like, with the European Cup win. But then there's such a dramatic fall off from that point, you know, which results in another relegation. But 87-88 to me represents that moment where things begin to change again. And although 87-88 was about promotion from the second division, it did very much, for me, feel like that sort of transformation back of the club, you know, which had declined so much, and actually brought into, you know, a period of being for Aston Villa that, you know, culminates again in some relative success in the 90s. So yeah, just a real kind of pivotal moment in that Villa story of the late 70s through to the end of the 80s.
Yeah, Dave Bowler, you know, our editor, our 1978, 79, 80 correspondent. He's very much of the mind that sometimes a step back can be, you know, the precursor to a huge step forward. And there's not always a bad thing to take that drop down. And there is that definite sense of renewal. I'd throw straight into that, and I didn't put it on the set list, that kit, which is kind of the Aston Villa take on the Denmark 1986 World Cup kit.
Yeah,
I'd throw that into the mix as being part of this epic renewal. I mean, I think it was Mitre kit the previous year, was it possibly? More of a traditional Villa type of shirt, but here comes Hummel.
Yeah, and it was. I mean, and particularly the famous scenes of winning promotion away at Swindon. We drew 0-0 on the final day, and they're wearing the away version, which is kind of white with light blue stripes. As you say, very much that sort of Danish dynamite. And it is. It's an icon. I mean, you still see it a lot around Villa Park. And that's what I mean about it being such a kind of key, memorable season. We'd had such a terrible sort of time, sort of post Tony Barton and to Graham Turner, Billy McNeill, that this was this renewal. And you're right, the kit absolutely represented that. To the point, I think the kits of that era, maybe a whole other podcast on its own, but even in those really sort of dour times where we were under Turner, we even wore a kit that didn't even have an Aston Villa badge on it. So Henson made our kits for a season. It didn't even have a badge. It just said AVFC. And I think, when you look at that just makes me feel a bit glum anyway, let alone the fact that we were toiling on the pitch. So you're absolutely right. Those, the Hummel kits that 87, 88 represented were iconic.
Yeah, without a shadow of doubt. I always loved that, whether it's the Coventry version, the Southampton version. They were absolute. I mean, polarizing kits at the time. I remember a lot of love and a lot of hate for them at the time. But I think even the people who didn't like those kits at the time, have softened on them over the years. Like you say, Villa tumultuous. We were chatting just before we were recording, saying we're back to the second division days of Aston Villa in the 70s, but even down to the third division for a few seasons, they were pulling massive crowds in the third division. And then this Ron Saunders powered kind of comeback, and via second division promotion 75, a League Cup winning again in 77, European qualification on a regular basis. Then this bit of a little bit of a lull as the 1980s start. It was almost like selling off the silverware as far as players were concerned, more outgoings than incomings, a lot of book balancing. Yet out of somewhere, Villa win the league title in 1980-81. I think from a 10th place finish in 79-80. A lot of players had gone. They'd lost players through injury as well. You look at Brian Little. There were a lot of reasons why Villa shouldn't be doing what they were doing in the early 1980s to go and win the European Cup as well. And, Villa were a team massively on the crest of a wave, 80-81, 81-82, even into 82-83.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we sort of go back briefly to Saunders, I think you described him as sort of Ron Saunders driven, and I think he did, he absolutely transformed, Villa's fortunes, and, only that promotion in 75 and that first League Cup win for him. But I think what was always interesting for me, Stephen, in terms of kind of building into that 80s period, is that he was quite happy really to reset the team, and was always looking to sort of build to that next point. And I think if you look at the 77 side, it's only really Dennis Mortimer and Gordon Cowans who featured in the epic 3-game final against Everton that really sustained beyond that. I mean, Chris Nicol was Saunders' captain, scored the winning goal in the final replay. He was gone, sort of thing. So I think he was always very aware that transition was kind of possible. But you're right, no one would have expected Villa to win that league in 80-81. And the fact that he did so with, obviously very famously, just 14 players and, a real kind of wonderful side that, for a lot of Villa fans of multiple generations now, the likes of Gary Shaw, Tony Morley, Dennis Mortimer, Ken McNaught, Jimmy, we could go on and on. I think have become that real sort of standard bearer for the club, really. I think what was interesting was that we then went into a period where we won that European Cup, but it was against a backdrop of Saunders leaving, of course, and Tony Barton, who was his chief scout, taking over initially as caretaker and then becoming permanent manager. But I think there was always a feeling that winning that European Cup was in essence a kind of another Saunders triumph. It was his team. They didn't in essence play in a different way, and I think that it absolutely was seen as that. But with full credit to Tony Barton for carrying that vision on. And 82-83 sort of represents this then, we are European Cup holders. And I think it's must have been about 6 trophies up for grabs at the start of that season, including like the Intercontinental Cup. I think you're right. It was kind of very much the tip of that wave in 82-83. But I think some of the seeds of discontent maybe had started to be sown. And I think that whilst Barton had done a great job in kind of, continuing Saunders' vision, if you like, I think he wasn't really able to sort of make his mark in a sense that he was, building his own team. It was very limited sort of transfer business. I think Steve McMahon arrived, in advance of that season, but very, very little else. In the previous year, it had just been Andy Blair, and so there was limited kind of incoming. So I think Barton didn't get to put his stamp really on that. And of course, the other factor in all this, and again, you mentioned Dave Bowler, who I know likes to remind everyone of Mr. Doug Ellis and the fact that he spent Villa's most successful period elsewhere, but he had arrived back in 82. And I think that very much changed a bit of the mindset of the club. And, Ellis had always been in his first spell at Villa very much about trying to manage the budget, not spend too much money, etc. And I think when he came back in 82, he would have said, people have questioned this, that Villa were, £1.8 million in debt. So Ellis clearly felt there was a need to sort of bring some of his parsimonious sort of reputation back into the club. And I don't think that didn't help Barton and that side in 82-83 either, because there was, again, there was a bit of a mind shift in terms of that. And there was, it was a difficult time. Villa there was various police investigations about the North Stand construction, and the architect, I think, was arrested, and there was various contention kind of going on. And I think that almost that competing in all those competitions meant that Villa didn't especially do well in any of them. And I think that they all often looked a little bit undercooked in one as a result of their performances in another. So I think it was a tough season. I think it represented, for me, the end of that period, and that real successful period. And I think the key thing for me during that season was a couple of things. We lost to Penarol in the Intercontinental Cup, and it wasn't so much losing to them, but the way that the stories came out a lot in the press around Tony Morley, Gordon Cowers kind of going out on the town and having a bit too much fun whilst in Japan. And what came across at that point was that Barton wasn't really the guy to kind of put some of that in check, I think, and whereas Saunders would have done. And I think that was worrying. And then on the sort of flip side, when we our defence of the European Cup, when we got knocked out by Juventus in the quarterfinals, this was a Juventus side, Stephen, which I'm sure you will fondly remember. I think 6 players that had played in the 82 World Cup final, plus Platini, plus Boniek. This was an outstanding side, but we knew that. But it also represented, for us, we were defending European champions, but we hadn't really added to the squad. We'd never really had those type of players. We'd had wonderful, wonderful international stars like Gary Shaw, but this collection of might that knocked us out in the form of Juventus, to me, was a bit of an honest wake-up call of a kind of limit of maybe where Villa could progress to. So it did seem, that season did really feel like something had to change.
Yeah, it's a season that Villa are massively stretched in. Like you say, the Intercontinental Cup, Tokyo, Penarol. There's the European Super Cup one against Barcelona, which we throw in there. Villa were very consistent in the league. They managed to finish 6th, which gains them UEFA Cup qualification for 83-84. There's that run to the quarterfinals of not just the European Cup but the FA Cup as well. As you say, it's kind of like an about face on. As a I'm not one that will do this, but there's a lot of people who apologists for Ipswich not winning 80-81 in the league title. They will use as a bat to hit the Aston Villa cause is that there wasn't much else to play for. It was literally the league, two domestic cups. There's never, no one wins the league title by accident. You sometimes get a season where more than one team would have been worthy champions. There might even be 2 or 3 sometimes. And that Aston Villa side were fully deserving in their league title in 1980-81. I won't have anything said about that. But 82-83 is the complete opposite of 80-81. There's that European Cup run to the quarterfinals, which means that they're still in there in March. That run to the quarterfinals of the FA Cup. There's trips to Tokyo. There's taking on Barcelona and keeping up a chase for Europe. That 82-83 side, that season, that does, I don't know, kind of like it falls under the radar for a lot of people in just how different it might have been. And within that, if Villa had less on the plate and could have achieved one of their targets, won the European Super Cup, so they did walk away with a trophy that season. But if they walk away with an FA Cup success that season or whatever it is, maybe they don't unravel quite so quick. Maybe Tony Barton is emboldened, and it's a different path. Maybe. I think you're right. I wouldn't want to be dismissive of the Super Cup. I think that was a really successful one against a Maradona-less Barcelona. I remember the tie at Villa Park. I think there were three red cards and 10 bookings. It was quite a different Barcelona aesthetic to maybe that we experience now. But yeah, no, that was a superb win. I mean, things could have been very different. You're right. I mean, I still might contend that the unravelling might still have happened, because I think that although that success was potential success was on the table, I do think that the stuff going around the club, with Ellis coming back and some of the decisions around finance, there was an emphasis on youth, if you like, and this is a season where Mark Walters is first appearing in a Villa shirt. A young Paul Birch is on the fringes. So I still, it could have been a wonderful celebratory end to the era, I suppose, but I still do wonder whether there would have been quite a lot of change, because I think that, in essence, there kind of had to be. Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from there. Just going back to that Juventus side that you mentioned as well, they were at the peak of their powers that season. They should have won Hamburg's achievement in winning that European Cup is incredible. But if ever there was a season for Juventus to win it, that was the one. They were frightening, truly frightening team. So many players at the peak of the powers. A showroom, Michel Platini and Boniek, and there's so many.
Oh, it's unbelievable, Steve. One of my favourite, the now dearly departed Gary Shaw. One of my favourite things I ever heard him talk about was that quarterfinal, and he talked about how when he walked off the pitch at the end, he could still smell Claudio Gentile's aftershave. And, it just felt like this otherworldly kind of side, and it certainly no credit to Villa to kind of crash out, but
no, to keep it as close as they did was an amazing thing. It was a hell of a task to have to go up against that Juventus. 82-83, they were incredible. The following seasons, rolling into 83, 84, 84, 85, there's a couple of mid-table finishes, and then 85, 86, it's an uncomfortable season for Aston Villa. They finished 3 points clear of the drop zone in a very competitive battle against relegation, a season in which Ipswich Town succumbed quite satisfyingly from an Aston Villa perspective, I'm sure. Within those 3 seasons, there's 2 League Cup semi-finals as well. So, again, even though this is a Villa in decline, that there's clearly problems underpinning this. They're not a million miles away from the Twin Towers of Wembley on 2 occasions.
They're not, no. And I mean, it's difficult sometimes, isn't it, when you're sort of evaluating a period of time in a football club to kind of, not pick up on some of the positives. And, it was quite a brave choice to bring Graham Turner in as manager at the time. He was, had earned a degree of respect at Shrewsbury, but was still, it was a gamble essentially, and one in hindsight, obviously, we know that didn't particularly pay off. And I think that, although the story goes that Ellis perhaps wanted someone more experienced, so he pursued Big Ron at a time that he would obviously later become a Villa manager, but wasn't interested at the time. And I think that kind of shows that Villa were a little bit of a difficult task for someone to take on because they'd had this, this period of immense success, and how do you follow that? So Turner coming in was, I think, representative of a bit of a turn towards the idea that Villa were perhaps, going to look at a kind of younger, sort of hungrier type side. There just seems, Stephen, to be a real lack of planning, if you like, and particularly around transfers. We brought a kind of young, exciting Paul Rideout into the side, who scored quite a lot of goals, but then was sold to Bari. And Steve Stride, the long-serving Villa secretary, always used to say, Doug Ellis just could never resist a deal. If someone offered him money for something, he'd take it. And I think we saw a lot of kind of comings and goings. I mentioned McMahon earlier. Steve Hodge was brought in so they could play together, and then weeks later McMahon was gone. And I think there was that very muddled approach. And then, of course, the League Cup semi-final was. Obviously, I suppose Villa were expected to win it. We're playing Oxford. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the other semi-final didn't go to plan either, did it? Of course, because
no, absolutely didn't.
All got beaten by QPR.
Yeah.
It was, in some ways, it kind of sums up Villa at this time that we'd done quite well to reach that semi-final, but then ultimately lost a game that we were perhaps expected to win, and that is no disrespect to Oxford, who. They're another great side, great story, etc. Perhaps a future module if you haven't done one already.
Oh, definitely.
But yeah, I think it's there are sort of some glimmers of hope, but it feels really kind of muddled. I think is how I describe those seasons. Under Turner particularly. Yeah, muddled is the word.
Yeah, they are very scattergun. It's unreal that say these. I don't know, kind of in with a hint of finals and potential silverware. The players that have been recruited over that period of time. Mentioned Steve McMahon and Steve Hodge there, but in comes Steve Foster for a short period of time. Who'd gone to the 1982 World Cup with England. Paul Elliott, Martin Keown from Arsenal is a really shrewd signing. The absolutely amazing signing of Didier Cisse. Which just kind of like dumbfounded everyone at the time because French international players just simply did not come to the English First Division. And here is someone we'd seen in World Cups and so on and so forth. Neil Cooper, as you mentioned, Paul Rideout, Simon Stainrod, Andy Gray returns to the club after Howard Kendall breaks Evertonian hearts by selling him on.
See, Gray is a great example of what I'm sort of kind of describing as this sort of muddled approach, really, and the fact that Peter With had been deemed kind of too old, and had been shipped out to Coventry, I believe. But then we brought Gray back in, and do you know what I mean? It didn't feel like there was a real sort of plan, and Andy Gray had been a Holt End hero, leading up to the point where Villa won the league. Obviously, he departed by then under fairly sort of unceremonious circumstances, but he was, and it was kind of refreshing to have him back. But it does point to that idea that what was the plan, because what was Gray going to bring that With wasn't. They weren't dissimilar types of players. Gray was a little bit younger, I guess, but just again that word muddled. Yeah,
there's very much a kind of like I don't know, looking for the shot bought cure to whatever the ill is. We've mentioned Mark Walters. He's an omnipresent figure, such a talismanic figure at this point in time. Gary Thompson is another one that's signed. Tony Dorigo, comes through the youth ranks. Tony Daly, another one. There's plenty of the ingredients. Some of the ingredients are absolutely outstanding. Yet the finished recipe is one for disaster. 85-86. It's there to be, I don't know, used as the wake-up call for 86-87. And then again, Graham Turner has the chance to start 86-87. There's quite a disastrous, opening to that season. There's the 6-0 defeat at Nottingham Forest that sees his tenure come to an end. And then it's Billy McNeill, a high-profile appointment. So there's this squad of players that is the envy of probably a great deal of First Division clubs. There's a manager that you sit up and take notice of. You've got Doug Ellis, this larger-than-life chairman that absorbs so much publicity light, and but nothing. There's kind of like the key is turned in the ignition and the engine's not running.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, like you say, they were, the warning bells were ringing, and for Turner. The fact that he had the opportunity to start 86, 87 as Aston Villa manager, I think was quite a shock to quite a lot of Villa fans, really, because, and it had only been, whether he or Doug Ellis had promoted Ron Wiley to be kind of first team coach to add a bit of experience. I think that probably gave Turner a little bit of extra time and kind of credit in the bank that Wiley was able to kind of work through some of perhaps that experience into what he saw. And at the tail end of 85, 86, Andy Blair had come back in, Steve Hunt, who really kind of probably a little bit surprisingly, really sort of rescued Villa's season in a way of sort of being able to survive and sort of provided a platform for Turner in midfield at that point. So yeah, he had that chance, but lost 5 of the first 6, I think, and it was just it was just what was going on, because you're absolutely right, and when you reel off those names, sometimes as a Villa fan you forget, but. I mean, Mark Walters was exceptional. I mean, he was, and ultimately would end up, of course, leaving the club for Rangers. But, exceptionally exciting player. Tony Daly, a couple of years even younger than that, but again on those fringes. Martin Keown, I think, was he's much maligned. I suppose in some ways now, particularly by Villa fans actually. But at the time, an exceptionally promising young defender who, for the following seasons for Villa, would be an exceptional addition, and obviously would go back to Arsenal and win lots of things. But yeah, when Billy McNeill came in, this was a legend. This was someone that both as a player and relatively as a manager had built a fairly kind of cast iron reputation. So it was seen as right, this is the man that can keep us up. And it did, to be fair to him, it started okay. I remember we drew 3-3 at Anfield, and this was seen as being, okay, a bit of a kind of line in the sand, and had some early wins. But I mean, the end of that season, I mean the stats are appalling. I mean, Villa won just 2 of their last 21 games in the league. It's no wonder, of course, they then finished rock bottom. Really terrible record, and it just nothing. You're right, nothing was going wrong. I mean, apparently the players used to call McNeill McBingo, as what he'd do. His sort of despite his reputation, should we say, that some of that tactical nous was a little bit lacking, and he'd sort of say things like, "Oh, we'll cross it in the box and bingo, we'll score." So he became known as McBingo, and yeah, just. Again, I mentioned a Gary Shaw quote earlier, and another one that I think fairly sums up this season is that Gary Thompson joins, who, when you read Chris's Slum Sport book, he talks about it was a delayed transfer, really. He kind of, West Brom didn't want to send him to Villa, so he had a year out at Sheffield Wednesday and then came to Villa. And Gary Shaw apparently said to him, welcome to the club. You're a couple of years too late, big man. And I think that is, again, that sense of unraveling. This was the final bit, and I think that again, if we've talked quite a lot about transfers, and again, it was that sort of muddled approach to me. I mean, McNeill brought in Warren Aspinall ostensibly from Everton, but really, I think he'd been playing in the lower leagues. I think with Wigan, and he'd scored quite a few goals. I remember, McNeill said, he's coming in to keep us up. And you think, really? Like, gosh, no one's heard of this guy. Like, is this, probably what was quite a lot of pressure on some young shoulders. But I suppose what else was McNeill supposed to say? And equally, there was probably very little money available to bring in that striker that every team across the world wants to, score goals and save a season. And unfortunately, Warren Aspinall wasn't that man.
Wasn't the man, was he? Wasn't the man. I mean, a neighbour didn't throw out before who is the bedrock of this side, Nigel Spink. You've got one of the best goalkeepers in the First Division as well. Within this trajectory that brings Aston Villa, well, I will come to that in a bit, actually. Just go back to Billy McNeill. It is an amazing start. I was at that game, that 3-3 draw, that mad 3-3 draw at Anfield as a kid. An amazing game. And then his next 4 in the league, next 5 in the league, he wins 4 out of the 5. Losing away at Watford is the only defeat. There's victory at Coventry City, a win at home to Southampton. There's a win at home to Newcastle United, and a win at home to Leicester. No, Villa are out of the bottom 3, and it is quite amazing that from November 8th onwards there is just 3 more league victories.
It's staggering, isn't it? Really?
Again, it's another mad anomaly when you look at it. This clear new manager bounce that soon wears off. But as you mentioned, if the players are seeing Billy McNeill as something of a one-trick pony, then once that one trick starts to fail, the whole idea of a plan B, C or D becomes back to scattergun, and it's reverting to what has become a kind of type for the last 3 seasons at Aston Villa.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it felt like an inevitability in the end, long. I mean, it still can't, it just doesn't compute, does it? That period from November. So, we'd resigned ourselves, I think, to relegation at that point, which obviously was, 5 years after being European champions, where we are relegated. Obviously, barely a decade previously had been back in that second division. So I think, there is that, it's this huge growth and high to then that decline. And, it was disastrous in some ways, but it was not a surprise. And I think that, that's even the more worrying thing, isn't it? This hadn't come out of the blue. This is just stated for, 3 full seasons really of just treading water to then survival and then just that complete unravelling under McNeill. But it gave us a chance to build again, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, to put the top out on Billy McNeill's, I mean, it's interesting that November 8th, where it starts to go wrong for Aston Villa, that game, it's Billy McNeill returning to Main Road to take on Manchester City, who's walked away from, to take the Aston Villa job. There's a kind of interesting pathos at play, and these markers in the ground upon this journey that takes Aston Villa out of the First Division. It's I didn't looking back now that I can remember that, but something I've forgotten about for many years was that the striking point, the ignition for the lighting of that touch paper that'll lead to relegation actually starts with McNeill going back to his former employers.
A good twist of fate there, isn't it?
It is a wonderful twist in so many respects. Yeah, Villa don't pick up another win after that defeat to City until Boxing Day. There's a 2-0 win against Charlton Athletic. They hold Liverpool to a draw again, 2-2 in mid to late February. There's quite a few draws along the way, but there's some disastrous, 5-0 at Southampton. There's a 1-0 win at home to Coventry on March 28th.
Yeah, I think they'd had 3 players sent off against that in that 5-0 Southampton game, Alan Evans being one of them. And it was chaos. It was absolute chaos. And that's what I mean about relegation. Relegation is never a good thing, but we were so resigned to it that it didn't seem quite as catastrophic as perhaps it was, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally does. There's a win at home to West Ham on April 25th, which is, I don't know, it just prolongs the agony that little bit further for Aston Villa in this respect before there's a defeat at Highbury against Arsenal. Again, an evocative thing. That's where Villa clinched the title in 81. And then they kind of limp out sorrowfully on I think it's a game that takes place on the Monday bank holiday. I think it is the Sheffield Wednesday game that eventually sees Villa drop out of the division. But like you say, there's this interesting kind of the paths that Aston Villa are taking at that point in time. And there's certain Graham Taylor who's reached the plateau with Watford John Barnes is hovering. He's heading towards the exit door at Vicarage Road. There's a run to the FA Cup semi-finals that is ruthlessly ended by Tottenham at Villa Park, of all places. There is very much a definitive concept that Graham Taylor has gone as far as he can with Watford at that point in time. He obviously will return to them further down the line, but in the summer of 1987, even then, it's still quite a shock for Graham Taylor to drop down a division to take a job. It's a huge job at Aston Villa, but it's kind of like he's dropping out the first division to take this on.
Well, yeah, I mean, and let's be honest, who would have wanted to oversee the wreckage that existed at Villa Park in the summer of 1987, let alone Graham Taylor? I think that's the bit, the fact that he was dropping down. I think you're right there. He'd done fantastic work at Watford, but he probably felt that, he kind of needed some, a new challenge. Used the word plateau, which I think is fair. But not only to drop down a division, but to drop down to a club that, yes, okay, 5 years previously had been the European Cup winners, but as we have described over the past half an hour or so, had unravelled to a point of real sort of disaster and chaos. So the fact that he was up for that was quite a shock. And I think when he was unveiled as the manager, he himself, I can't imagine Doug Ellis was massively pleased, described it as a shambles. And the fact that he was aware of that. But then you're right, Villa are a historic club, and yes, those periods of intense success were quite early on in our history, and then have been dotted in since. But it's a big job, isn't it? And Taylor would have understood that. And I think that he was the type of manager who wanted complete control, and I think he saw an opportunity with Villa to get that, which was slightly at odds with Doug Ellis's reputation, but somehow, or in through his sort of persuasive, managing of Ellis, really, Taylor was able to completely reinvent the way that the club operated. He had the players train at Villa Park, for example, because he felt that they'd fallen out of love with the place. Players weren't allowed to live further than 25 miles away from B6, and things like that. Wouldn't let them wear jeans, and they had to wash their own training kit, all these sorts of things. So he was this sort of manager, and what a fascinating guy. And he always said, there was always a perception, I think, that players don't like that sort of treatment, but actually Taylor would argue the opposite and say that players need that structure, and actually often kind of flourish within it. And I think he did very early on create a renewed atmosphere around the place that the players really did benefit from.
Yeah, it is. There's almost like I don't know, it's not a quick fix by any means of the imagination, but he comes in and he cuts away quite a lot of very good players. I mean, Tony Dorigo's moved on to Chelsea, with whom he will then get relegated with at the end of 1987-88, and an absolutely amazing double for him to be involved in. An Aston Villa relegation in 87, then a Chelsea relegation in 88, and then be at the World Cup 2 years later, and a league champion by 92. There's a magnificent story that falls under the radar in itself. But yeah, it's very much kind of a meeting of minds, as you say. It's the right man for the right job at the right time, with what he saw as the right set of players once he'd done his I don't know, kind of rearranging of the chairs almost. It's very much, this isn't, I think we mentioned it in terms of kind of like, turning the key in the ignition and the engine's not started. He comes in and he would get the nickname Tinker Taylor for other reasons later in his career, but he's coming in, he's tinkering with the engine and saying, well, we can get a tune out of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, in 87-88, he used 26 players, which is, considering that Villa used 14 when they won the league, is shows that there was quite a lot of flux. I think Taylor brought in players that he knew could perform in the way that he wanted. So Steve Sims, who he'd managed at Watford, came in to play with Keown, and I think they were a wonderful partnership, actually. And I think he knew that Villa were going to have to build from that quite solid base. And to be fair, it's kind of what his aesthetic at Watford was, and then with sort of quick wingers. And although we lost Mark Walters to Rangers, Tony Daly was coming through to kind of give that outlet. But, a couple of signings that he made, I think, really go sort of underestimated a little bit. So Kevin Gage, who we signed to play at left back, was phenomenal in that 87-88 season. Scored some crucial goals. Real powerful, energetic fullback. We also signed Stuart Gray mid-season. Towards the end of September, rather, and he was again a really crucial component of that kind of engine room, if you like. And of course, Alan McNeill, who was injured at the start of 87-88, but then came through to really be a pivotal player. And he wouldn't thank me possibly, but he's not necessarily prolific in that season in the second division, but his link-up play and the goals that he set up for Gary Thompson, who scored some crucial goals over that season. But and also again sort of feeding Walters whilst he was still there, and then Daly. He was a kind of a missing piece of a jigsaw, really. And let's not forget that I think Warren Aspinall, who I was a little bit scathing of earlier, was still around and was top scorer in 87-88. So perhaps maybe had found his level a little bit, but did really contribute. So, but you're right. Taylor did experiment and he tried lots of things, but he ultimately had a very set idea of how he was going to play, and that generally worked. All of course supplemented by the arrival of a certain David Platt from Crewe, which probably was the icing on the cake of kind of Taylor's vision.
The season itself starts, I know, not in huge better form than the previous one had finished. They win one of the first 7. The early signs are, not particularly encouraging ones, but there is very much a kind of, a defined kind of settling in period.
Oh yeah, we were in the bottom 3. I think after the first 4 or 5 games, we lost to Blues, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, at home as well. Yeah,
yeah. We would write that later in the season by a Gary Thompson brace at St Andrews, but yeah, we didn't start well, and I think that's again, I mentioned Stuart Gray and then the other Andy Gray. Yeah, they would come in sort of September-ish time, and I think those were important players. I think that what we saw probably in August was Taylor still understanding what he had and sort of piecing things together. But then, that sort of progression from there. It's a real shame that Mark Walters leaves sort of during the season, because he was, and again, in that sort of September upturn, I always remember he scored a hat-trick against Palace. We beat him 4-1, and he was just electric that day. And you just thought, this is someone who can really drive us towards promotion. But yeah, that we really pick up, and there was a period of time, Steve, where we won 4 on the bounce, beat Oldham, Bradford, Swindon, and then that Birmingham City 2-1 away win with Gary Thompson acquiring Villa legend status in the process. And I think that we were top of the pile at that point. And I think as 1988 begins and we beat Hull on New Year's Day 5-0, and I think that is this is the point now where Villa fans are again sort of starting to believe, really.
Yeah, there's a huge run. Like I say, we spoke about those first 7 games and the difficulties there, but after that, things really click in. I think there's one defeat in the league in about 25 games that stretches all the way to the start of February. Another, there is the sale of Mark Walters to Rangers, but there's also the loss of Steve Harrison, Graham Taylor's right-hand man, who takes over as manager of Watford after the Dave Bassett experiment at Vicarage Road comes to a juddering halt. There are kind of like things to assimilate for Aston Villa as part of this. Like you say, Walters is in amazing form. He's sold. There's a bit of harmony in the dressing room, but then the right-hand man goes. and Taylor, and within this, Aston Villa are under pressure, but we're kind of like they're within a very competitive race for promotion. This is a wide open race for so much, this all the way to the finish. Actually, I think there's many sides that we're in with a shout of promotion that season. I can remember that Bradford City side being particularly good that year.
Yeah, although they kind of fell away because it was a strange city. You're right, it was hugely competitive. And I mean, the league was won by Millwall, who for a long time didn't really look like they were going to compete. And it was, in fact, they beat Villa at a point where they almost then sort of went on a run and just sort of surged past, ourselves, Bradford, Middlesbrough. And you're right, hugely competitive. And I think there was pressure because, Aston Villa were Aston Villa, and, the fact that we're talking about it now as 5 years since they were European champions, everyone knew this, everyone was aware of this. So it was, they were a big draw, not so much of Villa Park, actually, where they, attendances that season were really low, with the exception of one game, which I think we'll probably touch on. But, really, really low, like, 12,000 people turning up. So, as much as I'm talking about a reinstallation of belief, I think that, it was a relative one, shall we say, Stephen?
Yeah. I mean, the pressure is alleviated. It's layered on. Amazingly, Aston Villa, are twice live on ITV within the space of about a fortnight, I think it is. Late January, I can remember Liverpool going for the fourth round of the FA Cup, and actually being a little unsettled by the fact that here's Liverpool doing so well in the league, unbeaten at the time. We'd lost in the League Cup to Everton at Anfield, and then righted that a few days later by smoting them in the First Division, in front of the BBC live cameras. A few days later, so it was kind of like the one defeat had been righted, and then it was kind of like, well, here's this Aston Villa side doing really well in the second division, looking the deal. There's a potential threat here. Liverpool play exceptionally well that day. There's two beautiful goals from Barnes and Beardsley, but Villa, really make Liverpool earn that victory. And
I think particularly at the start, I remember Tony Daly being exceptional and Grobbelaar. We kind of experimented often with Mark Lillis up front, and he played up front that day. I remember Grobbelaar making a save at 0-0 that people were excited. It was the best attendance at Villa Park since the 1980-81 season, which is, yes, Liverpool were in town sort of thing. But again, I think points to that kind of that desire for that sort of big game. And yeah, I think, Villa did compete. And actually, I think, it was an important staging post probably for Taylor and his players to kind of measure up against, even in defeat, a side as strong as Liverpool. So I think that, as I say, even the lesson in defeat was important probably.
Yeah, I can remember that game well. The sense of nerves going into which were exacerbated by, I think was it Gary Gillespie was out injured and Roddy Whelan picked up an injury, so we were fielding Steve Nicol as a central defender that day, and Gary Ablett dropped in at left back, and Nigel Spatman had to come in. So it all added to that sense of, we could be off balance here. But and then a fortnight later, it's Middlesbrough. It's the top two teams. ITV are drawn enough in this second division promotion chase, and the revival of Aston Villa and Middlesbrough as well within that, to go from 1986 and the gates being closed at Urson Park and a football club on the brink to suddenly chasing promotion back to the first division. This was a big draw. This game, Aston Villa versus Middlesbrough.
And I think you're right. I think there was a lot of attention on that promotion race because it was tough, and that did sort of creep down into sort of a wider national sort of consciousness. Of course, Villa lost that day, which was actually, we were in a bit of a rut really then, sort of following the cup game, because we'd played Leicester directly after Liverpool and won. And I think that was quite an important win. And Mark Lillis, who I mentioned earlier, scored, and Alan Evans. but we were it felt like we were then putting ourselves in a position where we were going to kind of grind out some wins to see out that promotion. But then the Middlesbrough game began a sequence where I think we lost 5 out of the next 8, starting with that Middlesbrough game. And Tony Daly had scored, a decent goal for Villa, but just, and again, a goal that actually shows the importance of Alan McNeill. I mean, he held off Tony Mowbray for what seemed like the whole pitch, before putting Daly in to score. But Middlesbrough, as you say, were a strong side and came back to win 2-1, which kind of reignited their own sort of belief in that promotion push. But then again, we just couldn't then sort of build again. We went to Blackburn in the next game and lost. So Platt scored his first goal for Villa that day, but we couldn't. We lost 3-2. Blackburn then took over at the top. So we were losing games to teams that were, directly in competition with us. And I think that worried people, because it's, we were quickly being overtaken by the teams that each week we seem to be losing to. But then bring it back. We beat Plymouth 5-2. Platt scores again. This is, he's blowing everyone's mind. Like, who is this guy that's arrived from Crewe and just can't stop scoring? Paul Birch with a couple of goals. Again, Tony Daly exceptional. So then suddenly we're back on the top, but only on goal difference. So it's just, very cliche term, but just nip and tuck every week, and as we know, the season will come down to those very fine margins of goal difference and indeed goals scored.
Oh, well, indeed. Yeah, the fluctuations, we spoke of that opening 7 that Villa find difficult, but then there's this run of 1 defeat in 25, a great account of themselves against Liverpool in the Cup, that 87-88 Liverpool as well. And then, yes, that Middlesbrough game, it starts a run of 9 league games where there are 6 defeats. And some of those, the fact that 3 of them at home, it's Leeds, it's Stoke, it's Oldham. It is the ultimate test of nerve for Aston Villa in the final 4 games. There's Crystal Palace away, Shrewsbury Town at home, Bradford City at home, Swindon Town away. And they come good when, it's Middlesbrough that actually falter, as well as Bradford City. Both of them lose the final game or the final Saturday that they lose. Everything contrives to kind of like fall into Villa's hands at the finish line. It's an incredible thing, but that's not to say, again, shades of 80-81. Villa earn what they achieve within this. When they are asked to prove their mettle, they do it.
Well, yeah, like you say, these things don't happen by accident. I think you're right to those 4 games. I think the first of those with the Palace game and Platt again puts us 1-0 up, of course, away from home. And firstly, again, I can't talk highly enough of David Platt's contribution to Aston Villa, particularly in this second half of this season. He is absolutely the driving force alongside Gordon Cowans in midfield. We managed to kind of blow that game a little bit because we're 1-0 up. Ian Wright scores a late penalty to draw, but what was clearly going to be quite an important point. It's interesting you mentioned that differential of home and away, and we actually set a second division record for away wins. I think it was 13 by this point, which was a record, and yet we were poor at home. Really, it was the away form that sustained the challenge, and I don't think there's any particular known explanation for that. In some ways, I think that maybe a bit of kind of Rankolo crowds at Villa Park, that idea of Villa were a kind of big name and teams were enjoyed going to Villa Park and trying to beat them. But it's an interesting differential. But ironically, having drawn with Palace, we're back at home, and our friend Warren Aspinall scores a crucial winner, in from the cold as we beat Shrewsbury 1-0. And again, that massive, over the spell of those 2 games, 4 points to really, keep us in that mix. But it's that penultimate game of the season against Bradford where it was almost, Villa felt they had to win because of where Bradford were around us. And again, as I've mentioned earlier, we had this tendency to lose to teams around us at the time, which then meant they overtook us. So it felt like it was absolutely crucial that we got a win. And we were not convincing that day whatsoever. But our man David Platt, again, 1-0 win at Villa Park. And again, another cliche, Steve, but a win's a win, and it just felt vital because it kept us above Bradford by winning and on goal difference. And Middlesbrough then are only a point ahead. So Millwall by this point I think had actually already won the second division title, but we are absolutely in touch and distance going into that final game, which is, as you say, away at Swindon Town. And it was a pretty agonising day, really. I mean, Villa played well. I remember Gary Thompson hitting the bar. Platt hit the sort of angle of post and bar, and it just felt like we just weren't going to score. Like the ball wasn't coming out to anyone, and it was just quite frustrating. But kind of a valuable point as it turned out. And I remember Bradford and Middlesbrough games lasted a little bit longer than ours, and I seem to remember it felt like an eternity. It was probably about 7-8 minutes of just waiting for the news that both Bradford and Middlesbrough had lost, and therefore Villa had got that second promotion place. Not even on goal difference, on goals scored, because our goal difference was the same as Middlesbrough. But yeah, we'd scored 68 goals compared to their 63. So that was enough to secure that second spot. So tight until the end.
Within that, it's with a bit of joy, optimism, trepidation to make the step back into the first division. Taylor does strengthen further, going back into the first division. He picks up Chris Price, Derek Mountfield. Along comes Nigel Callaghan, who'd played for him under Taylor at Watford. Ian Ormonroyd will come in, Ian Olney. I think I would suggest a collection of very Graham Taylor type of players. But the return of Gordon Cowans is massive, as part of all this as well. And David Platt's part, you've mentioned him. The emergence of Tony Daly. There is so much falling into place. Having discussed kind of like Villa falling apart in a peculiar way, all the ingredients to do well are there, and then to slide to relegation in such a startling manner. Suddenly, here's Taylor pulling together, a very Graham Taylor side, but one that is exciting to watch at times. Especially down the wings with Tony Daly, what David Platt was capable of doing. You can't have Gordon Cowans in your side and not be spraying the ball around with a bit of panache. Here's an Aston Villa side that it's kind of there's two sides to the coin, and I think 1988-89 kind of proves that.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I think Taylor's got obviously quite a lot of credit in the bank, if you like, and I think it was quite hard to know sort of how Villa would do in that first season back. I think that we certainly felt that we deserved to be back, and we were kind of back in our rightful place, and all these sorts of things. But actually, you're absolutely right. There was a nucleus of a really strong side, and I think the signing of Derek Mountfield was an exceptional one, actually, and I think would go on to, in the following season as well for Taylor, be quite important. And I think he offered again that sort of robustness that Taylor liked. I mean, I think that some of the other signings, when you mentioned Ian Ormonroyd, we used to call him Sticks because he's very tall and seemingly very brittle. But I think it was those players that in that first season back that had got us promoted in essence. I mean, Platt, you mentioned, scored 15 goals that first season back, but I mean, Alan McNeill scored 22. And at 37 between them is some going. And you're right, Cowans, absolutely kind of allowed Platt to flourish, really. So it felt like we did have that nucleus of a really good side. I guess the target was always going to be about sort of survival, consolidation, all this sort of thing. But it did kind of unravel a bit, Stephen, that season. In the last 15, I think we only won twice. So it was, it wasn't a comfortable survival, put it that way, And I think, if it wasn't perhaps for the goals of McNeill and Platt, we may have found ourselves in quite deep trouble.
Yeah, it's a really interesting set of results. Unbeaten in the first 5, but there's only 1 win. There's 4 draws amongst that. Within that, they only win one of the first 8 or 9 because there's so many draws. There's some big wins in there. At home to Everton, at home to Tottenham, nothing to be seen at. A draw at Old Trafford against Manchester United. But there's then these kind of like amazing kind of peaks and troughs, really. There's 3 successive defeats in November against teams that you think they should pick up results against, having just beaten Everton, Tottenham, and drawn at Manchester United. They then lose, at Southampton, at home to Derby, away to Coventry City. There's another, 4 games unbeaten through December, and then kind of New Year's Eve, a 3-0 defeat at Arsenal. An Arsenal that will go on to win the league title. But then there's defeat at Liverpool early January. But then there's victories against Newcastle, Sheffield Wednesday, Luton, Newcastle. Again, there's draws against Norwich and Middlesbrough. So there's these like unbeaten runs, but with caveats, with lots of draws. There's those 2 defeats at the beginning of May at home to Southampton and away at Derby, which brings the ambiguity over whether or not Villa will escape the drop. And I think it ends up coming down to West Ham losing at Anfield a few days before that infamous game against Arsenal. Liverpool win 5-1 on the Tuesday night before the Friday against Arsenal. A win for West Ham on that night would have sent Villa down, as unlikely as it was at that point in time of West Ham going to Anfield and winning. Yeah, there's it's the strangest thing, to come so close.
Hit and miss, wasn't it? It was just
really, really hit and miss. And you look at the goal score as well, and yes, Alan McNeill scores so many goals, yet the goals dry up, hugely from mid-January onwards. He scores the 3rd goal against Newcastle on January the 14th, and after that he scores just 1 more league goal. So many of the goals are loaded in the first half of the season. So there's these peaks and troughs. So in a way that you get to the summer of 1989, you've survived the drop. You've then sold Alan McNeill to Bayern Munich.
Yeah, Ellis still can't resist a deal, you see. And this is someone who scored a lot of goals in the first division, but 1.3 million is a lot of money in the summer of 1989, I guess, isn't it? So I think, and then we also lost Keown in that summer as well, which I think was, probably
that's right.
In some way, in some sort of paradox, is that almost that was more keenly felt, in some ways, because he'd been exceptional, both in a very poor side that got relegated, really, but then in that promotion season again, playing with Steve Sims was wonderful, which, as I said earlier, doesn't chime too well with kind of his perception in Villa fans, now, but was a great loss, really. But of course, we did replace him with a certain central defender that went on to become possibly Villa's greatest ever player in Paul McGrath. And Taylor sort of switched in that, moving into that second season back in the first division to 3 at the back with Mountfield, Kent Nielsen and McGrath. And I think that gave Villa a much more solid platform with which to, ultimately go on and experience some relative success compared with, that, as you say, a very kind of close shave of relegation the previous season.
It is a peculiar, again, it ties in so much to, the volatility of Aston Villa across this period of time. Yeah, to go from, 1 West Ham victory at Anfield, from going back to the second division, to pushing Liverpool for the title the following season, 89-90. You say the implementation of the 3 at the back, the recruitment of Paul McGrath, absolutely inspired. But yeah, it doesn't really make sense, that loss of Keown at the back, that loss of McNeill up front. Alan Evans has now moved on. a last remnant of that European Cup winning side. There is so much to point towards Aston Villa not doing what they do, but that team that Taylor pieces together is absolutely well balanced. It's very, very good. It plays some excellent football. You've got Gordon Cowans, who's a year or so back at the club, so he's back into the groove of things. David Platt growing exponentially. Tony Daly, having the season of his arguably the season of his career. He's wonderful throughout that season. And then there's the odd tweak here and there. You've the Ian Olney being this not misfit striker, but kind of like under. The expectation on him wasn't massive, shall we say?
No, and I think it's again. You're absolutely right, Stephen. The 89-90 season almost just encapsulates the randomness of Aston Villa over this, the preceding kind of decade, 12 years, because again, Villa started the season really poorly again. To the point that I remember there was definite talk of Taylor being under some pressure, and as we are all aware, Doug Ellis, doesn't necessarily give people a lot of time. So there was a real sense that are we going to struggle again? Is Taylor the man? But to then have this poor start, but by February to be top of the league in February, to the point where almost. Some Villa fans would say that we kind of blew it. We were top. We had some wonderful results. I remember beating Everton 6-2. Platt exceptional. It was exciting. But as I say, some Villa fans would say that we blew it. There were two key results that ultimately kind of let Liverpool back in, and then we didn't see him for dust really. But we lost 3-0 to Wimbledon at home, and then 2-0 away at Coventry. And it just felt like that was, we'd given Liverpool that impetus back at that point, but because we were, for want of a better term, kind of in the driving seat. But then obviously it ended up finishing, 9 points behind Liverpool? Although interestingly, 7 ahead of Spurs in third, which I think is a nod to kind of Villa's success that season, is that whilst we perhaps ultimately lacked that real kind of experience and nous in terms of those kind of big moments, is that actually we had a pretty exceptional season.
Really, really, did you say not an impressive start, 1 win from the first 7, but then absolutely phenomenal through autumn into winter. I can remember February-ish, I think Villa were like 1 or 2 points ahead with a game in hand. But that last 13, it's 5 wins from that last 13, 5 defeats, as many defeats as wins with a trio of draws. Yeah, the legs kind of ran out, and I think the psychology that comes to be at play as well. That Liverpool have been there, done it so many times, and and only Gordon Cowans could draw on that experience. Really, Derek Mountfield as well. You were so that kind of that drift at the end of that season. But there was even the peculiarity of Ian Ormonroyd being deployed as a winger to the opposite wing of Tony Daly, but it was massively effective because Ormonroyd had come in, he'd not lived up to hopes as a centre forward. But I remember him being really effective playing out of position down the wing that year.
Well, he was, and there's kind of parallels with kind of Villa's current vintage in a way of kind of when John McGinn plays on the wing for Unai Emery. It's that kind of, you're not going to necessarily get a Tony Daly type performance, but he held that position really well. And I think that, he's a kind of, there are fond memories of him at Villa, but there is some irony that is perhaps his greatest contribution that season came out of position, particularly given that, we did again, we didn't replace McNeill, and, although you pointed out that the goals had dried up a little bit for Alan, I think that Ormonroyd only weren't that answer. We brought in Tony Cascarino in January. I think we'd just been eviscerated by Oldham in the FA Cup. which was quite a sort of a turning point in some ways. So we brought Cascarino in. The first time Villa had ever paid £1 million or above for a player. And again, he flattered to deceive, in the same way. So the fact that Ormondroyd was kind of deployed elsewhere, I think just was a desperate attempt to try and kind of get some balance to a side, even if those players were ostensibly out of position, because as strikers, these players were just not performing in the way we would have wanted them to.
When you look at Aston Villa in second place, as we mentioned, like 9 behind Liverpool in the end and 7 ahead of Tottenham, and Villa can boast a defence that's pretty much as good as Liverpool's. Liverpool conceded 37 that season and Villa 38. Yet it's the goals scored. They score 57, which is 2 less than third place Tottenham and 21 fewer than Liverpool in winning the league. Yeah, it's that peculiarity. If Alan McNeill on the end of that side, then maybe that, or a Clive Allen or someone like that. It's very much one of those great maybes. But within that, the parallel universe. Howard Kendall gets the England job in the summer of 1990 rather than Graham Taylor. Do you think he could have built further on this over those years? Maybe the next 3 or 4 years, would there have been a league, if not a league title, maybe some cup success that I don't know Villa would go on to under Ron Atkinson and Brian Little in the 1990s. Do you think Graham Taylor could have delivered that type of success?
I think he probably could have done. I mean, I think his journey, at Villa in what was a relatively short space of time, was again kind of a symptomatic of some of the peaks and troughs. But obviously the promotion, survival, and then the second place finish. And I think he got a huge amount out of that side that finished second. And I think that certainly if he'd have stayed for the following season when Platt was still there, I think we would have seen, if he could have solved the goal scoring problem, I think we would have seen some kind of growth in that sense. I think almost the pivotal thing was Platt, I think, actually. And I think that although Taylor had already gone by the time, Platt ultimately left, I think that the combination of them both going sort of again swept in really a period of renewal for Villa. And then obviously that would then come under other managers. And, the success you mentioned, first, the 2 League Cups with Ron Atkinson and then Brian Little, that with the exception of Paul McGrath, there's none really of Taylor's team, involved in those squads by that point. So again, there was a big kind of clear out. I think to go back to the original point, I think if Taylor had been there in 1990 to 91 and Platt's last season at the club, I think that there's no reason Platt's trajectory would have continued in exactly the same way and Taylor could have built on that. But Taylor's departure then ultimately Platt's the following summer just brought in a wind of change yet again to Aston Villa Football Club.
Moving on to our away from the football and towards our much loved and finally section, Ivan. I sent you a few links here and there. Our first one, January 31st, 1988. Aston Villa faced Liverpool in the 4th round of the FA Cup, as we mentioned. A Sunday afternoon broadcast live on ITV. No game on the Saturday then. Off to the cinema. What are we watching, Ivan?
Well, I'm going to go for Batteries Not Included, Steve.
Oh, good choice, good choice.
And I tell you what, again, I haven't watched that film for some time, but I'm gonna seek it back out. I think my son will enjoy it. But I always remember, this wonderful story of these tiny little robots coming to save the apartment building for the was it Jessica Tandy? I think played the
might be right there.
And there was this kind of subtext of a slightly deviant Hispanic gang led by a guy called Carlos, but again, the robots kind of came to save the day. These little, lovely, little, cute, little flying robots. So that's absolutely my choice, and I'm glad this has given me cause to remember that film and seek it out again.
Absolutely. I'd forgotten about that movie, but as soon as you mentioned it,
it's
the little flying robots. Yeah. Yes, that was like a properly unusual film. Number one, it's Three Men and a Baby, the unsettling Three Men and a Baby. In terms of Steve Guttenberg, should always be in a Police Academy movie. I think Ted Danson was in that one. He should be in Cheers, running a bar in Boston and all of that. Good Morning Vietnam, number two, a classic. I'd actually rewatched that not so long ago. Broadcast News, Throw Mama from the Train, which it was the mum from Goonies, I think, if I remember that rightly.
Yeah, no, you're right. I was always a bit of a fan of, I'm not sure how this will go down, but of Moonstruck actually. About,
oh yeah. The Cher movie.
Cher and Nicolas Cage with his. Did he have a false arm or a false foot or something?
Something like that. It does ring a slight. I think it was on one of those movies I watched once, and it was we had the local video shop, and that's where you go to and stuff like that.
I mean, me saying I'm being a fan of it is probably a little bit of a stretch that I can't remember.
But it's one that's stuck in the mind. Yeah, but yeah, some Overboard. I remember again. I think I watched that not so long, maybe over Christmas, when trawling through the streaming sites to see if there was anything to watch. Empire of the Sun, Wall Street. So a lot. January 1988 as Planes, Trains and Automobiles still in there from Christmas. Dirty Dancing. If you want your horror movies, Return of the Living Dead.
The Running Man, somewhere on that list, I think, as well, isn't there?
The Running Man is on that list somewhere. Yes, it is, number 21.
Of some strangely fond memories.
Yeah. There's The Last Emperor, which I remember being big. Yeah, there's no shortage of choices there, whatever you're into, really. Next up, we'll go with May 8th, 1988, the day after Villa have dramatically clinched promotion back to the First Division in a ultimately undramatic way with a goalless draw at Swindon Town. We're going to turn our attentions to what we are legally recording from the top 40, Ivan.
If I'm honest, some slim pickings in here. I mean, although I noticed the Anfield Wrap is still hovering just outside the top 10, but I think big fan of Fleetwood Mac's Everywhere, which by this point is I kind of had peaked weeks before, I think, but I think for me that would be my choice. Struggling with kind of Bananarama and Fairground Attraction, if I'm honest. Although because number one was Fairground Attraction, I think, wasn't it?
It was absolutely everywhere at the time, though. It's not a bad song, but it was just played and played and played. And then I think it was possibly used in a supermarket.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember what advert it was, because I think that has put whatever it was has put me off that song.
Yeah, it is one of those that was just overheard. For me, it's Theme from S Express at number 2. Love a bit of S Express. Bit of Blue Monday at number 3, although it's the 1988 mix. But yeah, Mary's Prayer, number 7, Danny Wilson. But there's some shockers in there. There's Loads of Money, Harry Enfield at number 4, absolutely abysmal. And as you go down the list, we've got, like you say, Anfield Wrap at number 30. Pat and Mick, Let's All Chant, number 14. Abysmal, absolutely abysmal. Some people should not be allowed their pocket money to go out and buy these things. Fleetwood Mac at number 21. Yes, you've got Prefab Sprout, King of Rock and Roll. I always liked that one at the time, number 28. And yeah, it does very much peter out after that. Certainly as far as the top 40 is concerned. Maybe scratching underneath the top 40. If you're into your Clash, London Calling, the 1988 remixes at number 46. Hot House Flowers, number 47, Don't Go. One of the first bands I ever saw live, the Hot House Flowers, as I seem to remember it. Next up, we'll go for our TV guide, I think. It is February the 14th, 1988. An unusual dip into the second division from ITV for the Villa Middlesbrough game, and it's a win for Middlesbrough. Ivan, you need the solace of something else on TV to take your attention away from this defeat. ITV, after the football, directly, has got the TV film The Last Electric Night. That's Night with a K. Another Disney tale in which a scruffy New York cop finds an Oriental boy on his doorstep, sent as a dying wish of the lad's granddad. Part 2 is next week. There is a bit of bullseye. Jim, smashing, knockout in brackets, Bowen with professional player Alan Glazer sharp stuff. Surprise, surprise at 7:15. Wish Me Luck at 8:15. Small World, and then it all gets a bit out there with the South Bank show by 10:30. BBC One, you could go for Facts. I remember Facts. It was kind of like one of the early magazine type programs on a Sunday afternoon. This could strike you as interesting. Frankie Vaughan tells you how matchmakers make matches. You've got the Antiques Roadshow at 5:30. Songs of Praise that we all duck out of.
What a choice.
With the cast of The Archers involved in that. All Creatures Great and Small. Wicker's World. 8:10. Alan goes deep into the outback and meets several Poms, including Sid Smith from Dudley, Worcestershire, who runs the most isolated pub in the world, 600 miles from Alice Springs. That's life at 10 o'clock. BBC Two, you do have a bit of Olympic grandstand at 5 o'clock. It's the men's downhill on the opening day of competition in the Olympic Winter Games. You've also got a bit of Crufts later on as part of the BBC Two evening, and Channel 4. We're in a Channel 4 era. You can have the business programme at 5:15, The Princess and the Pea at 6:15. What on Earth is Going On at 7:15? Well, for a start, Mike Harding is strolling in Nepal, and Paul Heine is discovering dangerous everyday things around the house. And there's the Stocks and Shares show. 10 great writers. It's Ibsen this week. And then we've got something called My Mama Done Told Me. And what she told me was not to get involved with nasty, brutish, loutish men at a Valentine's Day special, Ivan. Anything in particular?
Wow.
I mean, it's a bit of a rum to do that one.
Where to begin? Yeah, to be fair, I do remember the last Electric Night, but I would need to fact check this actually, but I'm pretty sure that it was like a pilot of what became, I think, was called Sidekicks, which followed this same kind of this New York cop and his grandson, this kind of sort of like quasi Karate Kid type.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I think I'd probably give that a go. I'm not averse to a little bit of All Creatures Great and Small, as a bit of a kind of Sunday night cozy viewing maybe, but yeah, there's not a lot that grabs me there, Steve.
There's not much to pick from, is there?
Gone out to kick the ball.
We'd have a bit of Bullseye on at some point, and to stretch out the Sunday night before going back to school on Monday morning. An insistence on watching That's Life. Hopefully, there's a dog that can say sausages or something like that involved in that. Headlines, back page headlines, Ivan. This is the days leading up to Aston Villa's relegation of 1986-87 being confirmed. Former Manchester United manager, future Aston Villa manager, Ron Atkinson, is apparently in talks with Fenerbahce over a £250,000 deal he's already turned down. This is all according to the Daily Mirror. So take it as gospel, if you will, or with a pinch of salt, or somewhere in between for some of the £250,000 deal. He's already turned down the Turkish national team, although there could be interest from Spain looming. We've got Mark Dennis, who agrees to a transfer to QPR. He's turned down Luton, and there had been interest from Wimbledon. That would have been a match made in heaven. Mark Dennis at Wimbledon. Oh, good God. Chelsea and Rangers. Rangers with Graham Souness looking interested in taking Mark Dennis to Ibrox. He's not long been sacked by Southampton as Mark Dennis for various wrongdoings, only to be reinstated when they thought, hang on, we can get a transfer fee for him. We've got Shilton, more Dell chaos. Shilton in crisis. He withdraws from the England squad for the trip to Turkey. He's set to demand a move from Southampton. Viv Anderson is of interest for Manchester United, so there's the Daily Mirror doing a bit of kind of like a broken clock is right at least twice a day.
Yeah.
You've got more Manchester United news. Brian Robson is under the spotlight after a horror tattle on John Fashanu, a potential leg breaker. There's actually a little bit of very unusual Brian Robson related criticism on the back pages over
unheard
that.
Of.
Absolutely unheard of.
I do remember that tackle. That was, maybe a tackle you more associate with Mark Dennis, ironically.
Absolutely. And Rangers 1, Aberdeen 1. has been enough for Rangers to clinch the Scottish Premier League title. Graham Souness's first season as Rangers player-manager, it started with a red card on his debut, and even on the day that they clinched the title, another red card is flashed at Graham Souness for let's say an eye-watering challenge on Brian Irvine. Anything in particular from the back page headlines that draws your interest most there, Ivan?
Big fan of Big Ron, and that's it feels like, of course, he would be interested in a multi-million-pound deal to go and manage in Turkey. In all seriousness, though, I think like such a big part of the story of so many clubs, but particularly Villa. So always interested to hear about Big Ron and Mark Dennis as well. So like the original psycho, wasn't he? Really, like sort of before Stuart Pearce. I'm just going to have a quick look, and I think he was sent off like 12 times. Something like that.
Yeah, there was all. I seem to remember. I don't think the house mixed it up. The incident with possibly Mark Wright, where they kind of like they pushed Laurie McMenemy into kind of like the communal bath at the Dell, and there was all sorts of ructions going on about that. And I think it's one of those that it might well have been Mark Wright that did it, but everyone presumed, that'll be Mark Dennis.
With his mullet, he had a mullet, didn't he? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Yes, but
always nice to hear about Big Ron, and nice to be in some ways reminded of Mark Dennis, I guess.
Yes, we do like a bit of Mark Dennis news wherever we can find her. Ivan, enjoyed it?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, really good to talk through some ups, some downs, probably more ups than downs, and yeah, just always good to speak to you, Steve.
Oh, magnificent. Really enjoyed it. It was great module, Ivan. Ivan will be back again at some point very soon. And all that leaves me to do is say thank you for listening. Do join us again on Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. Spread the word. And we'll see you again next time. Thank you and goodbye.